Jason suddenly heard loud bangs against the plane's windows. He had no idea what was going on. He was frantically looking around. Then his co-pilot gasped when he got warned by the cabin crew. Jason was totally baffled when he heard that a giant swarm of birds was chasing and attacking the plane. Jason tried to shake the birds. If they hit the engines, the whole plane could go down. The birds seemed to get more aggressive the harder Jason tried to shake them. Jason had no idea why, but it only got worse. The birds would not leave the plane alone. And from what he heard from the cabin crew, people got rowdy. They felt like the birds would make the plane crash. Jason assured the passengers that he had everything under control, but it wasn't true. Jason had to call for help. Jason had to call flight control to see what his options were. He had the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the birds would actually be able to crash the plane. The number of birds kept increasing, and they got even more aggressive. But there was a problem. Jason's co-pilot Jimmy turned his head around. Jason saw that he did not have good news. He couldn't reach flight control. There was no answer. Jason insisted that he keep trying. He informed the cabin crew, who had to calm the passengers down. The passengers could hardly watch out the windows because it was blacked out by birds. This darkened the whole plane, which gave off a horrifying vibe. The passengers grew really scared. Some of them even started crying. Jason had to act fast. Jason tried with all his power to gain altitude with the plane to shake the birds. But if he climbed too steep, it would endanger everyone in the plane. Moreover, the number of birds was so extremely high that they started to steer the plane down. Jimmy gasped when he saw buildings approaching. They were now hovering very dangerously above the city. Luckily for Jason, he could steer the plane to the countryside. He realized that it was futile to try and gain altitude. He had to get back to the airport and he had to land the plane. But how? Meanwhile, the cabin crew was dealing with the passengers. Some of them had even gotten out of their seats. They couldn't take it anymore, while others were just frozen in place. Nobody knew what was going on. Finally, Jimmy got the call to immediately turn around the plane to the nearest landing strip. Flight control had told them to redirect to a smaller airport closer to their current position. Jason did not waste any time and turned the plane. It was now getting really dangerous. By turning the plane, they hit a couple of birds, which seemed to trigger them even more. The birds were now hitting the plane, and small cracks started to show in the windows. Jason got informed that emergency services were already en route to the airstrip. Jason had to make sure he could reach the airstrip. Only then could they help them out. He had to do everything in his power to not crash. But when noticing the countryside, it got even worse. Immediately when leaving the city area, Jason noticed that the last part of the airstrip would get even worse. From the nearby forest, more birds emerged. They were instantly drawn to the plane. Jason got the feeling that this could only end in disaster. Jason noticed that the more birds attacked the plane, the closer they got to the engines. If many birds flew into the engines, it wouldn't be good. Jason was fully focused on reaching the strip when he heard a loud bang. The plane started shaking, and Jason could hardly control it. The plane was also losing altitude. The passengers also noticed this and immediately started screaming in distress. The worst thing that could have happened was happening. The engine burst. Jason's heart was pounding in his chest. He was so focused that he did not hear anything around him. The plane was now falling out of the sky. There was only one option that Jason could think of. This was his last shot. Jason had to make an emergency landing. He'd only learned about it in simulations during his education, but he felt it was his duty to make sure everyone on the plane was going to be safe. Then he saw something while descending. He saw a body of water in the distance, and he calculated that he could barely make a landing in the water. Landing on land would be rough. It would probably end up crashing the plane. Jason barely managed to land the plane in the water. It was not a soft landing, but it made sure that the plane did not break into pieces. His only concern was the safety of his crew and the passengers on the plane. He then heard screaming. The screams came from the passengers. They were terrified. Jason was stuck for a moment, but he managed to get himself out of his seat. But with the help of Jason, they had managed to get inside the plane. The cabin crew was in distress. The crew tried to stay calm, but from the looks of things, they were actually not fine. They had to open the emergency exits, but they also realized that the birds were still swarming all around the plane. What would happen if they opened the doors? They couldn't stay inside the plane, they had to evacuate. Jason tried to push open one of the exits, but it was completely stuck. He got a little emotional due to the stress and desperation, but luckily one of the stewardesses managed to get the other exit open. The plane was slowly sinking, but they realized that they had enough time to get everyone safely out of the plane. The crew tried to calm everyone down, but some people did not care for anyone else but themselves, and they tried to get out first, which they immediately regretted. The birds started attacking the people who got out first. Luckily, when most of them dove into the water, they were actually left alone. Some birds even flew into the plane, but they were mostly aggressive towards the entrance of the baggage room. What was in there? Before this question could even be answered, everyone had to get out first. Jason was the last one that jumped into the water, and luckily the Coast Guard was already on their way to save everyone. The birds started forming circles above the plane. While looking at the plane that slowly sunk into the water, the Coast Guard made sure that everyone got out of the water safely. More boats were now approaching, so everyone could be saved. The passengers kept pointing to the wreck of the plane. When Jason turned his head around, he gasped. The birds just kept circling around the plane. It was like they were actively looking for something inside. Jason was confused. He seriously had no idea what could cause all these birds to react like this. But it got even worse when the Coast Guard tried to get closer. When trying to get closer, the birds got even more alert. It looked like they did not intend to let the Coast Guard get close to the plane. But the Coast Guard was very stubborn. Despite Jason's warnings, they sailed closer immediately. Upon reaching the wreck, they got attacked by the birds. This actually scared the crew so much that they jumped off the ships. They swam back to the other boats. The passengers and cabin crew were totally baffled. What was in the plane? There had to be a way to scare the birds away, otherwise they could never get anywhere near the plane wreck. They had to come up with a plan because they had to get the plane out of the water to inspect it. There was no time to lose. Massive tugboats were already on their way to tow the plane out of the water, but the Coast Guard had warned them about the swarm of birds. Just like the first boat, they didn't seem too scared of the birds, but they should be. As they got closer, the birds started swarming again. The workers saw the sky darken with birds. This was a clear sign that they'd have to wait. They called for backup to ensure that the birds would be scared. This was the only way. The birds this time swarmed over the ships when they were farther away. Fortunately, the team quickly found its way. The tugs were able to get closer because the birds couldn't reach the captain. Fortunately, Jason came up with a plan. He had learned during his education that airports scare birds by making sounds. He told the Coast Guard that they could scare the birds off. The Coast Guard immediately acted upon this and fully blasted sounds out of their speakers. Then, something happened. The birds actually reacted to the high-pitched noise and fled back into the forest. The Coast Guard knew that if they stopped now, the birds would return. This was their opening, to ensure that the plane could be towed out of the water. Under guidance from the Coast Guard, the tugboats attached their cables to the plane. They started pulling. Luckily, the plane was easily towed. It would just be a matter of time before the plane could be searched. In the meantime, the police arrived as well. Jason was responsible for the plane, so he was immediately asked questions by the police. Jason had nothing to hide from the police, so he told them that it was just a regular flight. He'd made this flight almost every week without any hindrance until that day. He remarked that the birds, when entering the plane, were immediately going for the luggage room. This could actually be the key to finding out what happened here today. The police asked detailed questions about the luggage, but Jason referred them to the passengers. They would have the answers. All of the passengers, although very shaken, were immediately answering all of the police questions about what they were carrying and what was in their luggage. Except for one person who was set aside by the police. This one person was very shady about why he was making this trip. With almost every sentence he spoke, he contradicted himself. The police actually found this very suspicious. He did not want to answer when they asked him about his luggage. They did a background check on him. This raised even more questions. His passport seemed to be fake. This could not be good. The only way they could now identify him was by his fingerprints. When they put it in the database, they got an answer. This man was a convicted felon who had just been released. His documents were sealed by the government, so they had no idea what they were exactly dealing with. But all kinds of alarm bells went off. They still had to figure out what he was actually transporting and why the birds reacted to it. Luckily, the plane was finally taken out of the water. A special research team arrived at the scene to ensure that everything was carefully searched. But before they could even enter the plane, they heard many sounds. The birds had realized that the ships had sailed away and that the sound was now in the distance. They immediately swarmed the plane wreck. The police suspected that they were trying to get into the luggage department. The research team now got closer to the speakers. They scared the birds off and they entered the plane. It wasn't easy to get close to the luggage since the plane was totally destroyed. The door was jammed, but they got special tools to break it open. Immediately upon opening the door, they heard something out of the luggage department. When they made their way closer to the suitcases, they could pinpoint the exact suitcases the sound was coming from. When opening it, they all gasped. They immediately called to inform the police to detain the shady passenger. The name on the suitcase matched the name on the fake passport he had given when checking in. The research team carefully took the suitcases out of the plane. Jason ran towards them and turned pale when he saw what was in them. He realized the man was smuggling exotic birds. After calling more law enforcement, they got the exact details of why the man was detained. He had already been detained for smuggling exotic animals before. When released, he just started again. Jason got emotional. Eventually, the man was charged, and he would never be released again. He was charged with endangering the passengers as well. The birds attacked the plane because they could hear the exotic birds calling for help. Jason went to the trial, and then he burst into tears from relief. Everyone was safe, and he was relieved.